So it looks like our crowd's getting here, and it is to the top of the hour. If at any point you could fill out the three poll questions we have for you, we'd greatly appreciate hearing your opinion so we can share our message and adapt our message a little bit more in the future. With that, we're going to be talking about the unlocking the potential of perennial ground covers in corn and soybean production systems. This is a project that we've been doing for a little bit while now, and we have both Ken and Roger here to speak a little later. They have a lot of experience with this system, but we're really looking at a new way to cover crops. So over the next 5 weeks, we'll try and look at some of the specific areas where I think we've been making a lot of progress, understanding the system better. But to get us started today, Dr. Raman, professor in Ag and Biosystems Engineering, is going to kick us off, sort of giving us the vision of what the project is and a little bit about why we have some hope for this sort of production system. If at any time you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box and we will try and address them as they come up or at the end of the appropriate presentation. So with that, we should have about 40 minutes of content or so today, and then some time for questions at the end. And I'll get out of the way and let Raj take over. So thanks, Raj.
Thanks, Dan. It's a pleasure to be with everybody today. I hope everyone's staying warm, and I hope we'll keep this interesting enough to make you warm, right? So today's focus is on perennial ground cover integration into corn and soybean production systems, system basics and potential benefits. And Dan asked me specifically to talk about potential and scalability, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to whet your appetite, and then the real experts are going to talk. So here's Iowa in 2024. The majority of our landscape is in production ag. The dominant production system, I kind of kiddingly call it zero competition agriculture. I'll explain to you why in a moment here. This zero competition agriculture system is dominant. It's dominant because it's very streamlined. We cultivate one plant, we eliminate everything else. We try anyway. It's very high yielding. The lack of competition increases the row crop yields that we get from these systems. It's an extraordinarily reliable system, right? If you follow the program, you've got a very high likelihood of generating economic returns. And bear with me for a moment. It's highly scalable. We have machinery to do zero competition agriculture at scale. A lot of people, I think, don't appreciate what a very high labor cost, low energy cost country we live in. We have and that's been true for a long time in the United States. We have an agricultural system that developed in that context and reflects that reality. So if you think back to 125 years ago at the turn of the prior century, something like 50% of the population was involved in primary production agriculture. So to my way of thinking, that means that one day of work of a person might be able to feed a person for 2 days, 1-to-2 ratio. Today at $15 an hour salary and $4 per bushel corn, and I know we don't eat corn that way, but just get an idea of how much we pay for food calories in the raw state. 1 day of labor by one person creates calories for 1,200 people for a day, right? That's like 600 times more efficient from a food output to labor status than what we had before. People need to understand that we don't do this for no reason. We do it because it's an incredibly efficient and effective system. Furthermore, the infrastructure that we've built, the culture that we have, what our neighbors do, what the people in the county do, the policies that we have in place, and the markets that are available for farmers to sell their products all deepen the groove, if you will. So I've told you the good things about zero competition agriculture. Why wouldn't we just keep doing exactly that going forward? I think most of you here know that there are a bunch of unintended consequences, if you will, and they range from, in the lower left there, the decrease in soil organic matter, organic carbon that occurs over time. These are data that our friend and colleague David Lair, since retired, collected. And basically the blue bars show the kind of soil organic carbon that you would see in an undisturbed soil, and the orange bars are what you have after a century or so of agriculture. daily attachment program, daily erosion program, sorry, graph in the middle, map in the middle, showing that parts of Iowa are approaching 20 tons per acre of soil loss. That's not insignificant, and so on, right? These are very significant issues. Most of the farmers I talk to know about these issues and care about making it better, but it's hard to do. Cover cropping is a wonderful thing to do, I would argue. It addresses many of these issues. It's really not that popular. And I think it's hard to argue that it's just because not enough people know about it. I think there are well-documented actual tangible costs, and then I think there are also intangible costs like complexity that frankly are a barrier to more people adopting cover cropping. The perennial ground cover vision that Ken doesn't like it, but since he's here, I'm going to say it, that Ken Moore really started shepherding us down almost 2 decades ago, along with his friend and colleague, Roger Hintz, who's also here today. That vision is to simplify and reduce the cost of cover crops while also perennializing part of the landscape. And I'm going to put a little asterisk here and say, you know, at the current state of development of this technology, perennial ground cover might not be that much simpler, but we believe it can be developed to be quite a bit simpler. And that's what we're heading for. So we're here to talk about a vision that we're partway to achieving. So what exactly am I talking about? In these systems, you plant the cover crop one time, but you get the benefits for multiple years. That is the fundamental hook here. That ground cover, for it to work, it has to be complementary to the primary crop in both space and time. It's got to be short, it's got to be shallow, it's got to be active early season, it's got to be active late season. Can't be deep, tall, and mid-season active, or it's going to compete like all get out with the primary crop. Furthermore, we're not trying to harvest these cover crops. We're just trying to get an ecosystem service out of them. So they are not showing up at 4, 5, 8 ton per acre levels like you might see with some annual cover crops, where more is always better. We want just enough to get those critical ecosystem services. And those include all these things. I want to respect time and respect the fact that you can all read. I'm not going to read these all to you, but these are some wonderful benefits that can come in these systems. And some of them even lead to improved profitability, but that's only true if we maintain yields. So from a cash flow standpoint, and Cyndi Bartel, who led this paper and who's going to be speaking later, is here. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but basically, if you look at sort of a cash flow diagram for perennial ground cover, you can think of it along the lines of what's here. Don't treat this as this is, you know, written in stone, but this is what could happen. You spend some money in year 1 to plant, and then in the out years, you make money. In our case, because we're assuming that you can collect more stover and you have a stover market to sell to. We know that's not true of everybody. If you don't have a stover market to sell to, what's the benefit? Maybe a little less herbicide required, okay? Or maybe it's just that you get to take $80 planting event and spread it over 5, 6, 7 years so that it's only costing you $10 an acre on average per year, rather than $40, $50 per acre. Because we think these systems can be revenue neutral, close to or better, we think that these systems might scale. There are so many good things that we can do to make agricultural systems more sustainable that a handful of people do, but that are not adopted widespread, primarily because of economic barriers, I believe. And we find this vision very compelling because we think that maybe we can get it tuned correctly so that a lot of people will do it without costing them much at all, maybe making the money. Cyndi's going to talk about this more. I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to stop right there. My goal is to whet your appetite, make you go, huh? What's that? Maybe it's interesting. And I don't know if we should take questions or move directly to the second speaker, Dan, Captain's Airplane.
Yeah. So while Ken and Roger are sharing their screen or preparing to share their screen, if you do have a question for Raj, feel free to type it into the chat. And I think we don't have one right now, but I'd really like, while they're getting their screen shared, Raj, for you maybe to give just a 1 sentence of why this project really excited you and why you really see it as a more potential to scale.
Absolutely. And in fact, what I'm going to do is not answer the question you asked me, Dan, because what I didn't tell any of these people is that this project, you saw us say RegenPGC, this project, which is kind of sponsoring this event, is a 5-year, it'll probably be a 6-year because we'll do a 1-year extension, $10 million project that has both research, extension, and education, and commercialization themes in it. And that's trying to push this vision forward. I hope you got from what I said that this is a vision that's in progress. It's not all the way there yet. And through a variety of fascinating experiments and outreach to farmers and extension and so on, we're trying to move it to the next step. And I'm excited about it, to answer Dan's question, because maybe it's a vision that can cost out and get adopted at scale to make a difference to the soil and water of this state and our neighboring states. We have to go to scale. I'll stop there.
Perfect. Thanks, Raj. And I see Ken has his screen up, so we're in good shape now. Next up, we have both Ken Moore and Roger Hintz. These two gentlemen have the most experience of anyone of trying to manage and practically maintain yields in these systems. So if you have strong production questions about how do I make this system work, these are the two gentlemen to ask. They're who most of our team first go to when we encounter some trouble. So they've been doing this for a decade now, have learned a lot about how to make the system go, and hopefully we'll be sharing some of their best pointers for the rest of us. So with that, I'll get out of the way. Ken and Roger, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Dan. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, Roger and I are going to make this presentation together, mostly Roger, because Roger is the one who has the most practical on-the-ground experience with the system. So this thing sort of started in a theoretical way. You know, Roger and I, we've been working together a long time, like 30 years. And sometime in the past, we worked in pasture ecology, and we were talking about the ability to get plants to cooperate together in a plant community. And the idea came up with finding a plant that was compatible with corn that you could grow as sort of a perennial cover crop. So in my mind, theoretically, I always knew that this was possible. and Roger always knew that it would be hard. So we're going to talk a little bit about the theory behind it, and then Roger's going to talk about practical. So the reason that we think it can work is because there are certain plant community assembly rules that govern how plants coexist in plant communities. And so if we're thinking about the system from an ecological perspective, what we really want to do is create an environment where both types of plants can live and thrive. And so in the system, what we've been working with is corn grown on 30-inch centers. We sow the corn in 15-inch tilled strips, and that gives a base ground cover of 50%. So looking at it from above, you can see that half of the soil surface is protected from wind and water erosion, and that's a tremendous amount of cover. I mean, you can get really 90% of the benefits with like 10% cover. So it's huge impact that perennial cover crops could have. But underground, if you choose your perennial ground cover carefully, you choose a species that's shallow rooted, then the most of the soil volume remains available to the corn crop. So essentially you're growing a perennial ground cover that's trying to stay out of the way of the corn. And let me explain this a little bit more. This is just a slide from Dr. Fay that shows the rooting depth of several grasses. These are common grasses. I bet you know all of these. Most of them grow here in Iowa. So all the way out at the left is Kentucky bluegrass, which from the beginning is sort of been our idiotype for perennial ground cover because it's shallow rooted, it's summer dormant, it's perennial and persistent. And so if you look here, very little rooting depth here in Kentucky bluegrass as opposed to any of these others. So say corn is similar to Indian grass or even switchgrass in rooting. They're exploiting different layers in the soil profile. So you're keeping the roots of the perennial ground cover really out of the way of the corn crop, as it should be. The other way that you can separate them is in time. And so most of the ground covers that we've been growing are cool season grasses. So they tend to green up pretty early. in March generally, and they want to produce most of their grows during spring and early summer. Corn is a warm season grass, so it wants to grow when the cool season grasses are kind of like going through what we call their summer slump, and they're not growing very well. So the idea is just really to try to keep both crops in their lane. So one thing that we want to make clear to everyone is that this is not a practice that we recommend. At least Roger and I think the whole project would tell you, if you want to do this, you're going to need to wade into it on the shallow end. And really, what we're really looking for is not for you to adopt the practice, but for you to help us build a better practice and one that's more reliable and robust. We want to give it to the people who do this for a living and who know how to make growing crops work. And so we would encourage you after the seminar, if you're interested, to contact us. So we'd like to know if you're going to work with it. Good place to start is on the edge of fields. Treat it as a conservation practice initially, and then if it get it to work and you figure out how to make it work, then you can spread across your entire acreage. So with that, a little bit of caution, I'm going to hand it off to Roger. Roger, you want me to move the slides for you?
Yeah, because PowerPoint locked up on my computer about a half hour ago. So,
well, it wasn't even on mine until I realized that I was supposed to have it.
Ah. Okay, well, we'll kind of jump in here on how you can enter this system. And I guess I want to preface this with, we've been at this for 20 years, and I'm sure you've all heard the old adage with Thomas Edison that he discovered 10,000 ways not to make a light bulb before he successfully made a light bulb, and we are nearing that number, I think. So the easiest way that we found to on-road onto this thing is to recognize that you're already in a rotational system, whether that's, corn, soybeans, or if it is a continuous corn, but to not disrupt what you have going on, but to be able to find an on-ramp to this without, any sort of detriment to the system. And the best way to do that, we found, is actually fall seeding the cover crop. And if you look in the lower left corner of the picture there, you can kind of see the fall planting. That's when we would establish the perennial ground cover of the grasses. And during that first winter, they're not there in any big form. In fact, they'll probably struggle that first fall. You may only see little seedlings, and there's a lot more going on below the ground than there is above the ground, but usually it's there. And we've got, ways to help out that we'll get to in a little bit later here, but just kind of showing the year-round system here in the slide. So we make it through winter, get up to spring. It depends on the method that you use to establish the perennial ground cover. If you've established it in strips, or if you've established it as a complete cover over the ground, you will need to do some strip tillage, and that will allow kind of some free space for the row crop to grow. And then at that point in time, you plant, and we want to suppress the ground cover that you've worked so hard to establish. We're going to turn it brown for a while, and that'll happen right at planting, or maybe just right a little bit after planting. And it'll turn that grass brown for what we're hoping is about a 6-week period, give or take. And, sometimes the chemicals work really well, sometimes they don't. It's one of the issues that we've struggled with over time and are still working on. You get to the summer, the grasses kind of get over that suppression, start to green up a bit, but they're in that midsummer slump that Ken talked about, where they're not going to be too active anyhow. So at this point in time, it's really not a threat to the crop. We get towards late summer, that grass starts growing a little bit more. We get to the fall, you harvest, and right away that cover crop that you planted is already green, already doing its thing right when you harvest. So we'll go on to the next slide. So the most important, or one of the most important parts of this whole system, is the perennial ground cover management. So in the spring, you have to think of it as a weed. It is not your friend. So you want to turn it brown. Like I said, you can see in the picture there on the left, the corn's just coming up And it needs to think that it has no competition near it. And by midsummer, it's acting as a mulch. It's kind of contrary to what you would believe, but the grass growing there is actually preserving moisture below the ground. There's not as much water evaporating from the soil surface when there's a green growing mulch on top of it. And we've got all sorts of data to back that up. Then in the fall, that perennial ground cover crop shows up again, and it's just instantaneous ground cover. So we'll go to the next slide. The current best management practices for establishment, and this kind of varies a little bit, you know, with what you have available, what your set of conditions are. Our preferred grass is Kentucky bluegrass. We seed it in the fall, try to use a drill of some sort to do that, and then you strip tillage to maintain those strips so that the corn has a zone there that's not influenced by the perennial ground cover trying to sneak over and grab some moisture and nutrients out of there. And we can establish these with as little as 12 to 20 pounds of seed per acre. And you kind of see some other lines there too. Some of the other species that we've worked with and probably work well in a mix with Kentucky bluegrass are red fescue, any of the fine leaf fescues, and perennial ryegrass. The problem with Kentucky bluegrass is it has a 21-day germination time. So that's a long time that it needs to germinate and come up. And it has to have almost ideal conditions with fairly frequent rainfall events to make that happen. So if we mix in some of these other grasses, the perennial ryegrass and these fescues, they don't need nearly as long to germinate, and they don't need nearly as much moisture. And in the mix like this, we kind of see it as a progression over time. You might have some of the fescues and perennial ryegrass that are super present at the beginning, but those tend to die off and fail over time, whereas the Kentucky bluegrass is a lot more persistent and will you know, maintain or become that perfect ground cover that we're seeking. One of the varieties that we're used for Kentucky bluegrass, Mercury, is the one that we're using now, and it's got a little bit shorter time to germinate and develop. So, and this slide is just to show you what the grass could look like during the fall when it's established. You can see this is 40 days after drilling. Granted, these are in Nebraska on irrigated ground, so they had a little bit of advantage that way. And also want to emphasize here, this was established with a 40-foot wide landall drill. So, I mean, everything that we do, we've tried to work at scalable size, whether you're small, large, whatever. The equipment's out there to do this at just about any scale. Current best practices for developing and maintaining these strips. We've used cover crop seeders to plant the cover crop in rows. You can also do it with a regular drill, just block off different openings in the drill, as long as the spacings of the units line up with what will fit in with your row crop planting distance. We can solid seed, and this is what we've done for years and years here. Solid seed everything, and then we go back in with a strip tillage machine like you see there on the left to establish our strips. You know, can also solid seed and then follow that with banded herbicides, either with a hooded band sprayer or just sprayer attachments on the planter. We've done all of these, all of them work. And we want to stress here that the ideal strip is probably somewhere between 10 and 15 inches wide of the perennial ground cover. We shoot for 15-inch wide strips. We could probably get by with narrower, but that's our goal. And then we talk about the suppression of the perennial ground covers, and what we've used so far, Rockson paraquat and glufosinate. And you can see on the picture on the right, that's what you want the ground cover to look like for the first several weeks after planting. Like we said before, it's not your friend until this corn gets probably about to this stage or a little bit later. After it gets to this stage, it's really no problem for the corn. It will take off from then. And this is the hooded band sprayer down here at the bottom left that we use in a lot of our research. And we do recognize that not everybody has one of these. So everything that we've been doing, we've been trying to adapt to either this or just broadcast spraying, and we're developing chemical programs that we can use either or, so you don't have to have the specialized equipment to do that. And some of the other chemicals, we'll get here to the next slide, that we've been working on. Oops, we skipped one. Should be another one after that. We've looking at other chemicals. There we go. Looking at some other chemicals that we can use for suppression, and we're actually going to take a deep dive into that this year. Some of the chemicals that you've seen here, atrazine, ones that we've already used, paraquat, and then some of these others, but at varying rates and different combinations and with other additives in there, so that we can get that suppression for as long as we can without doing harm in the long term to the perennial ground covers. And some of these, you think atrazine, well, shoot, you put that on Kentucky bluegrass, it's going to kill it instantly. But it's been shown in some of the research that we've done, some of these atrazine, glyphosate at sublethal rates will not do long-term harm to the perennial ground covers. It's just keying in on those rates, and then there's certain circumstances where some of these chemicals work really, really well, and sometimes they fail really, really badly. And a lot of that depends on temperature, humidity, overnight temperature. And we've had all sorts of experience with that. So you get to the next slide here, and this is getting towards the end, but just wanted to show you, this is soybeans in the system instead of corn. We don't have nearly as much experience with soybeans as we do with corn in the system, but soybeans do work. This is photos taken from a Corteva trial conducted at the farm of Ray and Chris Gasser down by Corning in 2019 or 2020. I can't remember what it was. Really good Kentucky bluegrass establishment there. They harvested over 60 bushels per acre of soybeans off of there. And as you can see on the picture on the right, it's just instantaneous cover crop as soon as that combine rolls through there. So. And we've got a question there. Let me finish this slide and then we'll do questions here. So this is where was I going with? Okay, yeah. Ken had said this from the start. The whole idea of this came up with pasture dynamics. We used to deal with a lot of pasture species and realized their dynamics changed in their proximity and where they were with each other in the field. And that's how we came to this idea to begin with. And it's come a long ways. This is, I think, our 21st year now that we'll actually be doing this. So just want to thank everybody involved. Everybody that's presenting on here today has had an input on this in multiple ways. So we'll get to those questions now. Let's see.
Perfect. And yeah, and the question is just a little bit more about timing of herbicide in reference to the cash crop. So just a little bit more detail maybe on your spraying program, thinking about pre-emerge, and then for suppression of the grass and weed management, noting that we will have Erin talking next week about more of how to manage some of the weeds and suppression in some of these systems with work she's been doing.
Right. A lot of our work up until the last few years, we have divided management of the row crop strip entirely differently than the perennial ground cover strips and make separate passes with chemicals to do so. And we know that's not the way to do this. So what we're trying to do now is identify chemicals, and we've got a long list that are going to be tried here in the next year or so, so that we can do this in a single pass, that we can suppress the grass with the same chemicals that we're using for weed control in the corn. The problem is the rates on these start getting a little bit lethal to the grasses, and identifying those rates and then using kind of a combination of different chemicals. So we're taking a deep dive into some of these chemicals, their chemistry, what will the cover crops tolerate, and still allow us to apply herbicides that will do their work in weed management, suppression, but not be lethal to the grass. So
Perfect.
I don't know if that answered the question, but
Perfect. I think that's definitely a struggling area of challenge that we've seen in managing these systems. And Aaron from Kentucky will talk to us next week about some of the research we've been doing. If you could stop sharing your screen, please, and then we'll address everyone's favorite question. And Ken hinted at this one a little bit, but essentially, why are we using grasses? Why not a legume, white clover, other clovers? What made us really zoom in and focus on grass species for this system?
Shall I, Roger, or would you like to?
go ahead if you want.
Okay, well, so we're trying to identify species that are complementary in their growth to corn. And so legumes tend to be more deeper rooted, and they tend to be more summer active in terms of their growth than the cool season grasses we've sort of honed in on. So those are primarily the reasons. Then, for the most part, they tend to be too deep rooted and too competitive with corn for moisture to be an ideal perennial ground cover.
I will add the white Dutch clover, any of the white clovers have a lifespan of about 2 years under the system. They do not like growing under corn. Cura clover will grow with corn, but it is incredibly robust and likes to take over. It needs to be knocked down heavily. Otherwise, it's too strong of a competitor with the corn.
Perfect. So while this is a big project and we've tried lots of things, we felt like grass species were maybe a little bit easier to manage. And in week 3, we'll be talking about a grass species that goes dormant, maybe a little bit easier or earlier than trying to manage suppression with Kentucky bluegrass. So we'll definitely try and cover some of those questions in a little bit more detail. Philip, if you could share your screen, we'll answer one last question while you do that.
Dan, I'm going to hop on for a second. Ken, I hope it's okay. I mean, I put the link in to the Flynn paper that detailed the work you did looking at multiple different plants. I think it's important for people to see that, because I do think it's easy for people to hear us talk and say, well, why do you want to put a golf course out there? But it's a complex system. So I'm going to throw something in and say, you can grow all kinds of stuff between the rows. You really can. Most of them will cost yield. And I want to go back to what I said at the beginning. If you want to make a difference to what's going on in the waters of this state and downstream and to the soil of the state, you have to have something that people will do at scale. And giving people an option to do something that will only cost them 20% yield loss, well, is a total non-starter. So the truth is that the selection criteria for these covers are much tighter than maybe we let on when we talk about it. It's a very tight set of criteria that the plant that cover crop has to be able to achieve.
Perfect. And we do have one question that I'd like to try and address. It's, do we have any trials that don't use herbicides? And are we evaluating the ability of the cover crop to suppress weeds? So in terms of the second part of that question, Erin next week will talk about some of her work on cover crop's ability, the ground cover's ability to suppress weeds. I do not think we have a trial where no one is using herbicide.
We do not. All of our farms have a very strong weed seed bank, and there's no way we can make it work without chemicals.
I mean, I'll go a step
If
further. Even with chemicals, we don't necessarily get the weed suppression that we always want. How about that? It's a concern of ours. I think Brandon has an organic grower in Illinois who works with this system, and it's working for them. I don't know that that's a no weed system. And Woody Van Arkel in Ontario, Canada, has been doing some work, I believe, without herbicides. So it's not that it isn't done. Going back to these dominant systems on our landscape are using chemicals to control weeds, and anything we do needs to have a similar level of weed control.
One other point too is that some of the species that are mentioned in the chat box are actually biennials. So they're not a true perennial species. You can get 2 years out of them. And our goal in choosing the species, in addition to the spatial compatibility and timing that Ken mentioned, was also to choose truly perennial species that required one-time planting, and then to be able to figure out costs over a longer term duration, which we'll get to later. But that also was a criteria for weeding out.
Perfect. And we're starting to get a little long, so we're going to hold the discussion. Appreciate all the questions, but I do want to make sure we have time for our last two speakers. So next up is Philip Rockson. He's been a great grad student. And as we think about scales, one of the big concerns about scaling anything is how much extra time and labor is it asking during key moments. And that's what he's been working to visualize for us. So with that, please take it away, Philip.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Philip Rockson, a grad student working under the supervision of Dr. Raj and Dan Anderson. So this presentation will focus on comparing the labor and time demands of conventional systems, corn in annual cover cropping, in our case using cereal rye, and the PGC system for corn production. All right, so field operations are critical components of the corn production system, and these operations are part of the time-consuming part of the farming process. So some studies have highlighted these labor demands, and they are quite universal. So a commercial farmer will typically have some tillage operation, fertilizer application, termination of the cover crop if they are using an annual cover cropping system. So we categorize the labor challenges into 3 for the cropping systems we've selected. The first are the seasonal constraints, where you have tight windows for planting and termination of an annual cover crop, which makes it more labor intensive and demanding, especially during the peak periods of the season. You also have to deal with repetitive tasks involving planting, tillage, termination, and it can be quite a huge demand on the farmer. Also, farmers need to deal with the operational complexities. There are some operations which are highly sensitive to timing and which could impact both the yield and workload, increasing pressure on farmers. So some of you may have experienced these challenges when trying to complete the operations. And our proposition is that the PGC helps eliminate some of these multiple tillage processes and eliminate the annual termination of your cover crop. So here we have a side-by-side comparison of 2 cropping systems. And what we are proposing is after your first year of establishing the PGC, in the second year or the third year, your labor demands reduces quite drastically. And this is the cropping plan for 2 cropping systems. Here we have the conventional system and we have the PGC system in year 2. So from taking a good look at this, it may not be clear to tell that the PGC system has less labor, it's less labor demand compared to the conventional system. So in the PGC, after your year 2, the labor reduces due to the type of tillage you practice and the number of tillages required. This is not quite intuitive from using this plan. Also, the suppression of the grass is not quite clear in this system. The suppression of the grass, as Roger mentioned, can be quite critical, and if not done enough or if not done appropriately, could impact your yield eventually. Comparing the PGC to the annual cover cropping system, there are 2 operations that you clearly need to deal with else your yield will be impacted. Your harvesting could collide with the planting of the cover crop and also the planting of your corn. So late last year, we developed the field operation visualizer as a standardized approach to compare the labor and timing demands across multiple cropping systems. The goal is to help you track the operations, find the ideal windows in which to complete those operations, highlight the critical events, and identify bottlenecks. So as I transition to the next slide, I'll probably demonstrate to you the field operation I showed earlier in the Excel. All right, so here we compare again the standard the standard continuous corn with a PGC system. Here we have Kentucky bluegrass as our PGC. And you could see at the start of the cropping window, you have similar applications where you need to apply your fertilizer late in the fall and you do some tillage. So this is why you start to notice some of the difference. In your standard continuous corn, you do a chisel plowing, whereas in a PGC, you do a strip till, which could be less labor intensive compared to the chisel plowing. And as you progress through the season during the summer, you also have to do the field cultivation in the standard continuous corn, whereas you do a zone till in the PGC system. And with this FOV, you're able to clearly see when a time-sensitive operation needs to be completed, which is the separation of the Kentucky bluegrass in this case. So the second comparison is comparing the annual cover cropping, which we have CRI in this case, with a PGC system. So clearly from the onset, you can see that the annual cover cropping has two time-sensitive operations that need to be completed. You have the termination of the rye and the planting of the corn. Whereas in the PGC, the time-sensitive operation it still remains the separation of the KBJ. You also need to deal with the planting of your cereal rye late in the fall, and this is additional labor to the farmer. And clearly, you no longer need to reestablish your Kentucky bluegrass since it's a perennial, and that reduces the labor on the farmer. So when comparing our three cropping systems of interest in terms of the labor or the hours spent per acre with the annual cover cropping and the PGC system, in the very first year, they're almost identical because of the number of operations and the kind of operations required. The standard conventional system is quite less labor intensive compared to the two cropping system. But after the first year or in the second year, you see a drastic reduction in the labor demands of the PGC system. You spend less on the initial 3 hours per acre required, and there's less than 2.5 acres per acre. So to help put things into perspective further, I illustrated having a 1,000-acre farm and trying to use these three cropping systems on each of these 1,000-acre farms. So at the very beginning of the cropping season, the labor demands are quite identical. But when you move to the summer period, that's where you begin to, or the PGC starts to show its ability to reduce your labor drastically. At the end of the year, you may end up spending over 3,000 hours with the annual cover cropping system, and with a standard conventional farming, you spend over 2,500. Here, the PGC quite reduces it, and we expect to see about 9 to 27% reduction in the labor demands after the first year of the PGC. So to recap, we basically say that PGC helps to simplify the operational and labor demands, also helps to identify some bottlenecks required. And at the end of the day, we hope the PGC will be able to meet the farmers' requirements. It's still not fully been developed yet, so there's still some research ongoing, and there's a need for policy support as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Philip. As you stop sharing and Cyndi start sharing, we do have time for a quick question. But make sure you stop sharing your slides. And I do want to reiterate, is Philip showing a nice optimistic version of what we're working to? And we talked a lot about scale, but as we think about how to make this system scale, we recognize the importance of getting suppression to work with one pass. So when we think about getting less labor, that's critical to us for the success of the system. And Cyndi's budgetary presentation here is going to help reiterate some of that. She's going to talk about optimistic and pessimistic versions of this system and show that we recognize what it takes to be successful. And that's really been the drivers behind what we're doing for research. So with that, all yours, Cyndi.
Thank you, Dan. And can you see the very top of that screen, or is that cut off with my, can you see the very top line?
I see the top of your screen.
Perfect, thank you. So one of the most critical things coming from a 5th generation farm, and my husband is a 6th generation farmer, is return on investment. And we know that return on investment is deeply personal and nuanced for each farm. But what we really wanted to show was that not only does perennial ground cover make sense for the landscape, for natural resources benefits, but it also makes dollars and cents. So it makes both types of sense. And I really want to acknowledge Carrie and Ken and Raj, especially, who prioritize this project to make sure that PGC has a really great practical application. Oops. This is not advancing. There we go. So we don't need to tell this audience about the erosion that's happening currently. And this is a most recent NRCS inventory of erosion. And what we see is that the land that is most intensively farmed is also the land that's most subject to erosion. What we can also expect is an increased demand for corn grain and corn stover, an unprecedented demand to ramp up sustainable aviation fuel by several orders of magnitude. And what we need to find is a way to resolve that increased stover demand with soil erosion in a cost-effective way, which is really at the heart of this project. We know that there are many benefits of perennial ground cover that this previous speakers walked through. And what I really want to focus on is that perennial ground cover may cost less money. So what does that look like at the farm gate for the farmer in deploying this system? We're going to talk about policy later on in the series. What we really wanted to ensure was that the system, once optimized, can stand on its own. So today we're going to break down costs, revenue, and net return. The starting point is, how do these systems differ? And we heard from Ken and Roger and Philip, and to provide a snapshot with the biggest ticket items, we know that in year 2+ we've got strip tillage. We know that there's a suppression operation after establishment. And so we're going to couple that PGC suppression, the ground cover suppression, with herbicide. There might be differences in herbicide formulation, but the general operation with that spring suppression is going to be similar. We also know that in the fall, we've got year 1 grass seed planting, and you've got a no-till drill that we're going to use if you have stover removal already. If you don't have tillage removal, then, or excuse me, if you don't have stover removal, you likely then will have a tillage operation. After the establishment year, then we assume stover removal for both systems. So how do these differ under a pessimistic and an optimistic scenario when we're looking at an optimized system and a system that might not work out so well with undesirable weather conditions or a less evolved technology readiness level? So we can expect that there's going to be some yield drags with a pessimistic scenario. We can also expect that there will be more seed bed preparation under a pessimistic scenario and a more intense strip tillage and suppressant application. We expect that there's actually going to be a reduction in hauling, drying, and handling because of lower yield. There may actually be similar levels of field passes because the machinery has to go across the field to collect the material. But in the processing side of things, there might be a reduction. We also expect that the labor will be increased. And we can also expect then ultimately a reduction in revenue. So we wanted to present a really honest depiction between an optimized and an optimistic scenario and a situation which may encounter some real world challenges. So where did we get our input for the 2024 production year? We looked at first the following corn budget from the Iowa State University Extension Services. And we used 2024 numbers. This work was just published last year. We also interviewed Iowa retail agribusinesses representing 50 locations for herbicide costs. We wanted to get a really honest snapshot of what that looked like across the state of Iowa. And then also PGC seed costs from companies that are actually supplying the ground cover. We know that there are some changes from 2024 to 2025. Production costs generally have decreased just a bit. And we also know that yield has increased a few bushels per acre. But at this juncture, the spreadsheet I'm going to go over later that's available online captures those 2024 numbers because it also aligns very well with the paper that was published. What are our what are the take-home findings? We know that perennial ground cover may cost farmers less money in relation to standard business as usual corn. What we see is an upfront investment in the first year to get the ground cover established, and then we see cost savings. What we see under a pessimistic scenario, when we have more harrow work, for example, or a greater grass seeding rate, more strip tillage in the subsequent years after establishment, is that it takes a much longer time to return investment with a PGC investment. But within about 5 years, under optimistic scenarios and optimized systems, you begin to hit your ROI. We used a few returns and net revenue equations to calculate our savings. Our net return per acre equaled our revenue per acre minus both our fixed and variable costs per acre. And our revenue per acre equaled our price of corn by bushel per corn plus the price of stover by ton of stover. We made some assumptions on our return and net revenue, and these are also represented in the spreadsheet as the default option. Our expected selling price on our corn bushels per acre was $5.05 per bushel. Selling price for stover was about $50 per ton. That created a revenue neutral scenario on the standard business as usual corn production. So it zeroed out that standard corn production, so we could easily compare our PGC scenarios then to standard corn. One of the big ticket homes for these findings is the amount of stover that can be harvested off of the perennial ground cover acres, especially after that first establishment year. So even with overall reductions in corn grain under pessimistic scenarios, you still see an increase in the total amount of stover you can remove from the field. That's especially encouraging as we expect our sustainable aviation fuel markets to ramp up. What we also see when we compare then cost per year, net return per acre, and net return per acre as a difference from our standard business as usual continuous corn is that with a really healthy stover market or sustainable aviation fuel market, you're going to be able to pay for the implementation of perennial ground cover in the first system year under optimistic conditions. What we also see is that under a pessimistic scenario, there's really not a good way to make the system float. And I think this really emphasizes why it's so critical to make sure that systems work before they're deployed on the landscape, which is something that this team is deeply committed to. What this really big spreadsheet represents is a lot of the time and effort that's been invested in accounting for every single operation, or at least the vast majority of operations that a farmer is going to encounter when they're putting in a corn crop. And this, again, is heavily influenced by the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach continuous corn budget. And the numbers that I just walked through are represented in the default version of the spreadsheet. The yellow cells are cells that you can edit and adjust to reflect your individual operation. And we go through each of those scenarios, like standard continuous corn, year 1, pessimistic and optimistic for PGC, and then year 2, pessimistic and optimistic for PGC, so that you can really tailor this to your operation to get an idea of where PGC may fall for you. Where do I find the spreadsheet? On RegenPGC.org under themes and objectives. If you follow that scroll down menu to objective 5, socioeconomic impacts and policy, out pops to the left the PGC enterprise budget where you can click. It'll take you to the web page then where you can download both the budget and the spreadsheet. And then also I really want to make sure to emphasize this great collaboration with Iowa Soybean Association, ISA, and credit to Suzanne Fay with her awesome team, developed a cover crop economic simulator, and they included perennial ground cover as one of the cover crop options. So this is a really comprehensive tool for corn production that you can walk through. And I think she's on the call today. And so this has been a really great resource. It's updated also with the 2024 numbers that I shared. Thank you so much. And are there any questions?
Thanks, Cyndi. If I could get you to perfect, stop sharing your slides. And we did have one question, and it's related to
Sure.
how did you decide how much stover you could take off and why that might be more even with reduced yield?
So we decided on a stover cap just based on machinery limitations, which is about 70% of total stover production. We also know that there's quality considerations, especially for the ash that may be on the stover. But at this juncture, we think that the primary limitation is going to be a machinery limitation. You theoretically could take all of the stover off of PGC land because of the prolific benefits to natural resources from the PGC itself.
Perfect. And then one more was related to how common
Sure.
is it to sell stover? And given that, why are we really interested in stover?
So there's two ways that you can sell stover right now. There are limited biofuels plants, of course, and then also it's harvested for livestock bedding or feed. There's a way to break down lignocellulosic bonds to make it more palatable, especially for beef cows. But what we see is this magnitude of increasing SAF production. So we're expecting billions and billions of gallons to be in demand by 2050. It's a long-term project, and it's really about developing a way to satisfy that expected stover demand over the long term.
Perfect. Thanks, Cyndi. And we do have a collaborative continuation of this project with the Department of Energy, looking at some of those soil health and changes in carbon to better quantify how soil or corn stover harvest might be impacting some of those properties, and hopefully our ability to harvest stover. So a couple of last logistics for this webinar. Next week, January 21st, same time, right, noon, we have a group of speakers who are going to talk about suppression and weed management within corn and production systems. So I know a lot of our questions today got at the heart of those. So Brent Wilson will be providing some detailed work that he's been doing with on-farm trials, how they're managing and how that's going. Aaron is a professor over in Kentucky who has really been studying sort of that weed suppression benefit and different chemical spraying options. And Amina is going to share an interesting experiment when we say we recommend a strip width of 10 to 15 inches for the ground cover. She has a really innovative experiment to sort of understand what that impact is. A couple other things for you. If you watch this webinar live and are willing, we'd ask you to fill out our voluntary demographic survey. You can either type in that web link, or if you use QR codes, you can scan that code. I need to give everyone a second while we do that. Melissa also shared the link to the demographic survey in the chat. So as I skip slides, if you miss it and didn't get the QR code to work, please click on that link in the chat. If you watch this webinar live and would like some continuing education credit for your certified crop advisor, email Melissa McEnany, MMCENANY at iastate.edu by Wednesday, January 14th at 5 p.m. Be sure to include your name, the name you use to watch the webinar if it's different than your actual name, and your CCA number, and she will fill out that appropriate paperwork on your behalf. Iowa Learning Farms was kind enough to help us promote, so we want to make sure we're doing the same thing. In that vein, Alex from the Iowa Soybean Association is going to share some of their results for relay cropping management, which is growing soybean and rye essentially at the same time, followed by a year of corn. So a pretty interesting system that's looking at how they better capture and add some growing conditions to sort of those shoulders. You can sign up for their webinars at iowalearningfarms.org. And if you are interested in anything that was presented today, we do have one-page handouts or field notes to go along with the presentations, and you can download the slide sets if you'd like to review them later. Today's webinar will be made available on YouTube, hopefully within a day or two after we get it posted. So it'll take a day or two to maybe improve closed captioning and get it up there, but it will be up very shortly if you have a friend who you'd like to see this. So with that, thank you for your time today. We have about 30 seconds left in that 1 hour that I promised you, so just in time delivery. But if you do have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat yet as we finish up, and we'll make sure we start with those next time. Otherwise, thanks for joining, and thanks for our speakers for getting us introduced to the topic and some of the opportunities and challenges with managing perennial ground covers as a cover crop. Thanks, everyone.